Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned to just talk really quickly, a little short one today, about Clark Ashton Smith and the uncompromising dooms of Clark Ashton Smith. So, Clark Ashton Smith, a fantastic writer who is known today as being one of the big three of weird tales, along with Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft. And Clark Ashton Smith was popular in weird tales. He wrote a ton of stories, and he had stories in many different magazines. But yeah, he is definitely known as one of the big three of weird tales. A status he deserves because his stories are wonderful, horrifying, terrifying, creepy, and wonderful. He is not as popular today as H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, that's for sure. I kind of wish he would experience the kind of resurgence that Robert E. Howard has and H.P. Lovecraft has experienced, but probably won't happen. At least it hasn't happened so far. As Ray Bradbury said of Clark Ashton Smith, his fame is lonely. He is appreciated, certainly, but not in great numbers, and never has been, really. But his stories are just wonderful. He was primarily a poet, and he had some slight success as a poet, but he never had great success as a poet, despite his talent. And he was an artist, he was a sculptor, he was all kinds of things, very creative guy. And he wrote a bunch of stories in the 1930s for weird tales, 1920s and 30s. He was inspired in part by H.P. Lovecraft, whom he corresponded with. He was one of the Lovecraft circle of writers. And his stories do show an influence of Lovecraft, although they are very much his own thing. Clark Ashton Smith definitely had his own particular style. The language of his stories is often just beautiful. You can tell Clark Ashton Smith was a poet just by his writing style. And he was great at creating an atmosphere in his stories, otherworldly and sometimes very often horrifying. He wrote fantasy stories, a lot of dark fantasies and horror stories. And last night, I was reading. In the very, very limited time I have to read this week, I've been reading the October 1933 issue of Weird Tales, which is a great issue of Weird Tales. And that's when the story, The Seed from the Sepulchre, was first published. Now, sepulchre, whatever it is a word I've never encountered outside of books, so I am probably mispronouncing it. Sepulchre? Who knows? Somebody will know and tell me. But it's a wonderful story. And it is an example of the kind of thing that Clark Ashton Smith did so often, in that he would write a story and the main character was just doomed, or the characters in the story were just doomed. That's the thing about Clark Ashton Smith's stories. If you end up being a character in one of his stories, yeah, man, bad things are going to happen, and you're probably going to die. Probably. Horrible things happen to his characters and his stories. I mean, if you were in a Robert E. Howard story, and you were the hero, you could just fight your way out of everything. You could fight your way to survival, most likely, if you're in a Robert E. Howard story. If you're in an H.P. Lovecraft story, yeah, you might die, or you might just go insane, But you might survive. You have a good chance of survival in the Lovecraft story, maybe not your sanity, but you'll probably survive. If you're in a Clark Ashton Smith story, you're probably going to die. Horribly. Horribly. There's a strong sense of dread in a lot of Clark Ashton Smith stories, and that's why. doom is inevitable very often, as it is in this story, The Seed from the Sepulchre, which is a story that I first encountered. This is the second time I read it last night. The first time I encountered it in an unlikely place. I found it here in the big book of adventure stories. Is The Seed from the Sepulchre an adventure story? I don't know. It's definitely a horror story, though. I don't know if it's an adventure story. Definitely a horror story. So when I first found it and I first read it in this volume, I thought, this is kind of an odd place to find this story. But I was happy because it's a fantastic story. It's really great. And yeah, it is in this book, the big book of adventure stories. And it's probably been anthologized in other places. It's a wonderful story, and definitely worth seeking out. Basically, it's about two orchid hunters going through the jungles looking for orchids, and they encounter something ghastly and awful where they meet their doom. And it's basically, I won't really tell you what happens because it's a short little story and just ghastly and horrible. Basically, it's a killer plant story, but it's a great one with just fantastic imagery and just it was ahead of its time in the way in the kind of horror that it is, and just what happens to these poor guys. It's great and just terrifying. It's a frankly terrifying story, and it's a prime example of kind of the uncompromising doom that you will find in Clark Ashton Smith's stories very often. He didn't mess around, Clark Ashton Smith, and he would just come up with the most ghastly, horrible fates for his characters. And this story was definitely a good example of it. It's a great story. And the other story that comes to mind is another ghastly, horrible story, which takes place on Mars, which you could find, well, one of the places you could find it is in this book, A Rendezvous, in another word I can't pronounce. Averoigne? Rendezvous in Averoigne. Let's just say that that's what it is. Also, you could find it in the Penguin Classics edition of Clark Ashton Smith, which you can still get. I think that's still in print, I think. But there is a Penguin Black Spine Classics edition of Clark Ashton Smith where you could find the story that I'm talking about today, which is The Vault of Yovambi. The Vault of Yovambi. And that is a story that takes place on Mars with archaeologists exploring the ruins of an ancient Martian city, a dead city, and they encounter something absolutely horrible where they meet their doom. It's one of those stories, one of those Clark Ashton stories where they run into something and the characters encounter a fate worse than death, and then they die eventually. It's just horrifying. And again, another story that was very much ahead of its time. And it's just as horrifying today as it was when it was first published. Just a ghastly story. And it's one of those stories that when you read it, you never really forget it, I think. And Clark Ashton Smith, his stories, very often the plots were fairly simple. He had some fairly simple plots. It's not so noticeable usually just because the language is so beautiful in his stories and they're just so well written. But his plots are fairly simple. They basically involve very often, not always, but very often, a person or people going to a place where something terrible happens to them. They go to this place for whatever reason. Maybe they're archaeologists, maybe they're thieves. Maybe they're just going to the wrong place and something terrible happens and they might escape temporarily, but usually they will die, and even if they get away, their doom will probably follow them. As kind of happens in the Vault of Yovambi, just a wonderful terrifying story with a unique setting on Mars. It is a science fiction story, but also very much a horror story. His work just had that quality very often, where you go into these stories and you know something bad's going to happen, especially after you've read a few Clark Ashton Smith stories. You go in knowing, what's going to happen in this story. It's great stuff. So yeah, just me talking about Clark Ashton Smith. I should talk about that guy more often. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.